The engines had crept up the ruined road like a steady, exhausted heartbeat. It was April 1945. The sky over the Hessen Valley lay low and pale, and steam rose from the shallow gutters where rubble held the melted snow. In the market square, a single dandelion pushed up between stones, its yellow a tiny affront to the gray. Mothers clustered beneath the shell of a half-standing gable, clutching children to threadbare coats. Somewhere beyond the collapsed church tower, an American truck idled, its engine ticking as it cooled, and a handful of soldiers stood in a ring, passing around a tin mug of lukewarm coffee as if it were a rare sacrament. If this account matters to you, please like and subscribe to follow more untold stories. Stay with the whole piece to see how a small choice reverberated far beyond this square. Captain James Mitchell had been in Europe for nearly 2 years. He carried his fatigue in the thin lines at his eyes and in the way his shoulders never fully relaxed. He had seen towns turned inside out by war, had watched men he admired fall quiet from wounds, and had learned to parcel compassion into small acts that did not jeopardize the unit. That morning, however, the ration of calculation did not cover what he saw when a boy no older than 10 slipped from a woman's skirt and stumbled toward the truck, drawn by the scent of stew the cooks were testing. The boy's name, as the teacher later wrote in a letter folded into a chest and preserved in a community album, was Klaus. He had eyes too big for his thin face, and a cough that sounded like someone clearing soot from the throat. He reached the truck and stared up at the soldier stirring the pot, Corporal Harrison, a man from rural Ohio who still called his mother once a week and who flinched at loud noises even in daylight. Harrison looked at the bowl in his hand, at the thin broth, and then at Klaus, who had no bowl at all. For a long second, the world was nothing but the steam and the boy and the soldier's hands. "Captain," Harrison said. His voice was low. Mitchell had seen hunger before in refugees and POWs, but hunger in a civilian child hit differently. It was not the registered casualty of a battle report. It was an accusation. He felt, absurdly and vividly, the old domestic memory of his own daughter refusing to eat peas. He felt the soldier's code, order, supply, discipline, push against the human reflex to give. He also knew that discipline had at times hardened into cruelty in this war. Looting, reprisals, angry men who wanted the enemy to suffer as they had. Yet here, in the ruins, there was a child who pleaded. "All right," Mitchell said. He left his cup on the tailgate and stepped down. The wind took his breath in small, cold bites. He scooped an extra ladle from the pot and set it into a battered tin bowl. "Give him that." The bowl was too big for Klaus to hold easily. He grasped it like a lifeline and cupped the metal as if it might bite. The simmered vegetables and meat, sparingly used, watered down by necessity, gave off a warm, faintly sweet scent. When Klaus brought the bowl to his lips, his hands trembled. He drank small, eager gulps, and at the second sip, his shoulders softened. A soldier barked a surprised half-laugh. The square breathed an imperceptible collective inhalation, like the hold before an exhale. It was a small mercy. In a war that had measured losses in divisions and cities, the gesture alone would have seemed trivial if it had stopped there. It did not stop. Word spread the way rumor does in places where official channels are broken. A local teacher named Frau Zimmermann, thin, middle-aged, with her hair pulled back in a way that made her look more stern than she was, had watched from the broken steps of the schoolhouse. She recognized Klaus. She recognized, too, the pattern. Children who had not seen a full loaf of bread in weeks, families trading heirlooms for a crust, men who stared constantly as if expecting the next order to be the last. She walked toward the truck, skirt dusted with ash, and spoke to Mitchell in halting English. There are many," she said. Her German was careful, the vowels of a woman who had caught grammar and song, and whose language had been broken by loss. "They are asking if you have more." Mitchell looked at the line forming. Thin shoulders of men, mothers with babies, an old man with a bandaged hand who had served in the last war. He had the training that kept a unit functioning. Counts, needs, supplies, quartermaster reports. The field kitchen could not simply become a charity without consequences. Food distribution could breed disorder. It could be used by elements looking to exploit the hungry. It could create expectations his company could not meet tomorrow. But he had seen the boy drink, had seen the way the child's hands relaxed. He wondered what war meant if not to protect the vulnerable when structures failed. "Bring what we can," he said. "Line up orderly, no pushing." His voice carried the command of a man who intended to keep order and to do mercy without chaos. They served bowls until the pot slowed and the metal ladle scraped hollow against the bottom. Every time a bowl was handed to a woman, to a child, to someone who had hollow cheeks, a small murmuring ran through the crowd. The soldiers who had accepted the order did so quietly, their faces a patchwork of relief and awkwardness. Others had family photographs folded into their breast pockets. Others had nothing but the fatigues on their backs. Corporal Harrison, who had once milked cows before the war, watched as a child licked the last drop, and without being asked, wiped the rim with a rag and held out his hand for the bowl to be filled again. By late afternoon, the word had reached the rest of the battalion, and then the brigade. Americans were feeding civilians. The initial act, improvised and small, came to be discussed in logistical terms as well. The unit's quartermaster, Lieutenant Duca, tall and precise with ink-stained fingers, began to tally needs and losses on a scrap of paper. He compared the daily issue of canned meat, dried coffee, and powdered milk against the demands now placed on the truck stores. He calculated transfer rates, resupply schedules, and the distance to the nearest depot. Each figure in black ink suggested the shape of consequence. In the tented rear, a radio crackled. Mitchell, having anticipated that a local gesture would not stay local, sent a message up the chain. It was a short, factual transmission. Civilians in Markstadt, they used the nearest town name, were near starvation. Providing limited food would quell disorder and stabilize the area. Request guidance on further feeding. He appended a recommendation. If granted discretion, the unit could set up a more permanent distribution point. If refused, they would ration strictly to military needs. The reply came with a bureaucratic tone that carried the weight of strategy and the avoidance of sentiment. That evening, the order was read. Commanders on the ground had limited discretion to allocate supplies to civilians if such allocations would directly contribute to military security and order. The message cited field discretion and emphasized the need to avoid creating dependency or logistical strain that would reduce troop effectiveness. It referenced a field order issued at higher command, language that allowed but did not instruct compassion. Mitchell slept poorly that night, though he did not tell his men. He went over the ledger Duca had sketched, thought of the children Kriegsmarked with hollows and existing quietly. He thought of his daughter's face when he had left home, and the tiny bowls she used for porridge. He had been taught to think strategically, yet strategy rarely spoke to the ragged throat of a child. The next morning, he convened his sergeants beside the still smoking remains of a baker's oven. "We can't feed everyone from a single truck for long," he said. "But if we don't start something more organized, this will grow into chaos. We'll have crowds, we'll have unrest. We'll have people doing what people do when desperate. I propose a controlled distribution. A central field kitchen, tokens for households, a schedule, liaison with the town. We'll assign MPs to keep order. We'll document every ration served." Private Lewis, who rarely put his rifle down without looking at it, frowned. "Sir, what about supplies? Our men will be fed. But we're not in a position to let a town collapse beyond repair," Mitchell replied. "We hold territory, gentlemen. That's part of what we do. Besides, if they starve and turn to banditry, that would cost us more lives and supplies in the long run." Lieutenant Duca added his calculations aloud, sober and pragmatic. "If we reallocate 1/3 of the truck's daily field rations to the town for 2 weeks and secure an emergency resupply from the brigade depot, we can bring immediate relief. It will strain our margins, but it's feasible. Longer-term needs will require a depot transfer and approval for dedicated civilian rations." Word spread along the lines like a current searching for ground. Some soldiers greeted the plan with relief and a quiet pride that came from being able to act humanely within a violent machine. Others bristled. Men who had lost brothers, men who believed suffering should be inflicted on the enemy as punishment. A corporal named Grady, who had been shell-shocked in the Ardennes, spat when he thought of German towns in ruins. "They had their chance," Grady muttered. "Look what they did to ours." Mitchell heard the anger, and he did not dismiss it. He also knew that anger could harden into a policy that delegitimized mercy. He walked to the edge of the square, where an old man sat, clutching a photograph of a woman in a white dress. The man's hands shook as he traced the image. "Who is she?" Mitchell asked softly, not wanting to startle. "Meine Tochter," the man whispered, before the bombs. She taught in the village." His voice was a thread. Mitchell nodded. "Would she have wanted children to go hungry?" The man's face crumpled, then made a slow, stubborn resolution of its own. "9," he said. "She would have shared." The presence of civilians drawn to the truck continued to swell with the news of the controlled distribution. The company rigged a sign, hand-painted on scrap wood, announcing meal times and asking those in need to present a token. An ingenious, simple system. When a soldier gave a bowl for the first meal, he handed a scrap stamped with the unit's insignia to the family. Each token entitled a household to a single serving and prevented multiple claims. It was a small, wartime bureaucracy of compassion. Frau Zimmermann organized lists and assigned volunteers, older boys, a man who had been a municipal clerk before the war, to steward the tokens and keep queues orderly. The teacher moved like a conductor among the dust and rubble, keeping children close, teaching quiet songs to calm the anxieties that bubbled at the edges of hunger. For the Americans, she became an invaluable interpreter of both language and social meaning. For the townspeople, she became a bridge whose existence eased suspicion. Not all within the occupying force agreed. A radioed message arrived from higher command, questioning the diversion of supplies. The tone was clicked. Supplies were scarce, priorities needed to remain military, and civilians were to be assisted only insofar as their needs directly impact military requirements. There were, the message emphasized, concerns about public perception at home and the precedent such distributions might set. What followed was the kind of moral arithmetic that often haunted Mitchell. He understood the arguments: sustainability, chain of command, the need to avoid being seen as improvident with resources. He also watched a child sleep in the crook of his arm during a lull. The boy's breathing was shallow and hoarse, and Mitchell could feel the ribs beneath his own jacket when he tried to sit. The soldier's logics clashed with the human body's immediate presence. Mitchell drafted a field report that balanced both worlds. He wrote of the strategic advantages: local goodwill, decreased theft, and the stabilizing effect on a civilian population that might otherwise be susceptible to extremist violence. He detailed the logistics: quantities served, projected resupply needs, and a plan to source food from local bakeries where possible to stimulate recovery. He argued that feeding the town was not charity, but an investment in security. The report went up the chain with his signature. Then came what soldiers called an exceptional moment, a response that combined military reality with a measure of humanity. A field order from a theater commander, broadly worded, granting subordinate commanders discretionary authority to use military rations to feed civilians when it would directly contribute to military objectives and where local procurement was not feasible. The order did not mandate feeding, it authorized it, leaving the final judgment to officers at the scene. In practical terms, it meant that Mitchell could expand the distribution without instant rebuke. He could do so with the backing of an order that tied mercy to security, thereby giving him both moral and bureaucratic cover. He chose, however, to treat the authorization not merely as license, but as obligation. They set up a field kitchen near the ruins of the municipal bakery and expanded the token system. MPs directed lines. Volunteers carried the bowls to those unable to stand. The soup, thin, generous, and warm, became a center of life for a few hours each day. Alongside the steam and the bowls, small rituals re-emerged. A schoolroom, once a pile of broken benches, was swept and used to teach children letters again. A civilian pharmacist who had once worked in a nearby town shared scarce medicines and taught soldiers which local herbs might blunt symptoms of colds. There was even an afternoon when a battered leather ball was found in a cellar, and a group of boys, some German, some American lads billeted nearby, organized a crude game in the square. The sound of a ball striking worn boots, simple and absurd, made an odd punctuation to the day's seriousness. Not everything smoothed out. Black marketeers began to hover on the edges, seeking to trade stolen goods for tokens. A few soldiers, tempted by extra rations, bartered with locals in ways that undermined the token system. Mitchell and his lieutenants had to enforce rules to separate compassion from corruption. Discipline, they realized, was necessary to preserve the mercy they had chosen to practice. Statistical realities were never far. A quartermaster briefed Mitchell that diverting a fraction of rations could be absorbed for a short term, but sustained feeding of a large town required coordination with divisional supply and civilian relief organizations. American canned food and powdered milk could meet caloric needs, but fresh bread and vegetables were essential for the long-run recovery of a populace weakened by months of scarcity. The proposal moved from a makeshift project to a coordinated operation. Requests for convoys, liaison with nearby agricultural cooperatives, and contact with emerging relief agencies who were beginning, haltingly, to cross battle lines. Yet the moral dimension remained immediate. Soldiers who had stood at the ready, trained to shoot and hold ground, found themselves tenderly coaxing the first shy smiles from children who had known little comfort in years. A private named Alvarez, who had once been a baker in New York, taught one German woman how to shape loaves to rise from scarce yeast. He measured flour with the care of someone making something that would feed more than the body. It fed memory. In letters he later wrote home, he said that kneading dough felt more like prayer than any word he could find. There were also moments of stark confrontation with the recent past. A former mayor, his pride dented and his voice thin, stood before Mitchell and demanded answers about missing men and the lists of those taken in earlier roundups. The soldiers did not have the power to undo what had happened. They could only listen, document, and promise care for those who remained. Mitchell ordered that names be recorded and that any survivors found in nearby camps or secluded houses be admitted for food and medical attention. The record-keeping was imperfect, but it mattered. It turned individual grief into a traceable history rather than an anonymous ache. As the feeding program grew, so did the scrutiny. Journalists from both sides of the conflict circulated accounts, some praising, some suspicious. In letters back to the States and in cautious press releases, military spokesmen framed the effort in terms of stabilization and security, careful to avoid language that might imply improvidence. At home, the public was itself divided. Letters arrived to units, some from families who urged generosity, others from citizens who believed too much mercy would erode the moral wage of the war. Within the square, however, such debates were remote. The immediate work continued. Tokens, ladles, organized lines, and the steady habit of sharing a warm mouthful. Children who had once turned away from a soldier now accepted a gentle hand reaching out. A private named Alvarez, who had once been a baker in New York, taught one German woman how to shape loaves to rise from scarce yeast. He measured flour with the care of someone making something that would feed more than the body. It fed memory. In letters he later wrote home, he said that kneading dough felt more like prayer than any word he could find. There were also moments of stark confrontation with the recent past. A former mayor, his pride dented and his voice thin, stood before Mitchell and demanded answers about missing men and the lists of those taken in earlier roundups. The soldiers did not have the power to undo what had happened. They could only listen, document, and promise care for those who remained. Mitchell ordered that names be recorded and that any survivors found in nearby camps or secluded houses be admitted for food and medical attention. The record-keeping was imperfect, but it mattered. It turned individual grief into a traceable history. As the feeding program grew, so did the scrutiny. Journalists from both sides of the conflict circulated accounts, some praising, some suspicious. In letters back to the States and in cautious press releases, military spokesmen framed the effort in terms of stabilization and security, careful to avoid language that might imply improvidence. At home, the public was itself divided. Letters arrived to units, some from families who urged generosity, others from citizens who believed too much mercy would erode the moral wage of the war. Within the square, however, such debates were remote. The immediate work continued. Tokens, ladles, organized lines, and the steady habit of sharing a warm mouthful. Children who had once turned away from a soldier now accepted a gentle hand reaching out. A photograph taken by a soldier with a small camera captured a moment that would come years later to hang in a local school. A young American handing a bowl to Klaus while Frau Zimmermann stood nearby, her face caught between relief and the exhaustion of having kept a community intact. The photograph became a symbol. It was printed in a small local newsletter and pasted into a schoolroom, and decades later a plaque would bear a reproduction of that image with a modest inscription. In the photograph, steam rose between the soldier and the child like a veil of temporary peace. But for every image of tenderness, there were tensions that remained unresolved. Some soldiers resented being asked to act as caretakers rather than warriors. Some townspeople, fresh with suspicion and scars, wondered whether the Americans' kindness was durable or merely tactical. The commanding officers worried that committing supplies to civilians would weaken their operational readiness. And there were those, both among the occupied and among the occupiers, who had seen too much to accept sentimental narratives. They required facts, accountability, and systems that could transition emergency relief into the long arc of recovery. Mitchell knew that gestures could become habits only if they were embedded in institutions. So he and Duca drafted a plan not only to feed, but to rebuild. Bakehouses reopened under local management with American-provided flour. A medical tent offered vaccinations and simple surgeries. Teachers like Frau Zimmermann were given materials to restart lessons for children. Soldiers were ordered to assist where appropriate, clearing rubble, fixing roofs, but not to replace the local administrative effort. The aim always was to hand back capacity to the community. News of the operation, what soldiers had come to call, half-jokingly and then more earnestly, the Soup Kitchen Initiative, reached higher commands and, importantly, the Supply Corps. Approval for a sustained resupply convoy arrived, though conditional and constrained. The convoy would carry preserved foods, tins, and medical supplies, and would coordinate with emerging relief agencies who had begun to operate through liaison offices in liberated regions. When the convoy came, the square filled with people who had learned to hope in small measures. There were improvised celebrations, a child's birthday marked with an extra piece of bread, a sky made brighter for a brief afternoon by the game of baseball played with a borrowed bat, the sound of laughter, careful and thin, but present. Children's faces filled out from gaunt hollows to softer plains. A mother wrote later of the first full night's sleep she had had since winter. She woke and felt for her children and found them warm. Still, the legacy of that choice was complicated. In the months that followed, questions persisted. Had feeding civilians eased long-term reconciliation, or had it simply delayed painful reckonings? Had it created dependencies the nation could not immediately sustain? Or had it prevented the kind of desperation that leads to lawlessness and violence? For many veterans who had been there, the answer sat somewhere in between, pragmatic and moral, costly and necessary. Mitchell kept his own doubts close. When the immediate crisis subsided, he walked the square at dusk and found families gathered around the baker's oven, sharing stories and the awkward silence that follows survival. He passed by a small table with the photograph that had been copied and tacked to the wood. An older Klaas, now gray in the portrait, smiled mildly at the camera. Mitchell traced the edges of the paper with his thumb and felt the weight of what had been done. Not redemption, not absolution, but an act that had altered the texture of the town's aftermath. Letters and memoirs later claimed many things about the final months of the war: heroic charges, bitter retreats, vast strategic decisions. Yet in the pace between those large movements, in the narrow rooms and rubble-strewn squares, were choices that shaped how neighbors would find each other again. The provision of food in a ruined market was a small pivot point. It did not rewrite history, but it created a pulse of care that allowed ordinary life to begin its slow return. One afternoon, months after the initial distribution, the school reopened with a wooden plaque hung above its door. It bore a simple inscription in both English and German, commemorating those who had shared food and peace. Veterans returning decades later would say that the plaque served as a reminder that mercy, when combined with practical logistics, could help stitch broken communities. For some, the plaque was a quiet rebuke, a note that even in victory there remained a duty to humanity. There were, inevitably, stories of failure and of the darker edges of occupation. Incidents where discipline broke down, where soldiers and civilians clashed, where promises could not be kept. The feeding effort did not erase those truths. But within the square and onward into the countryside, seeds of recovery took root. Markets slowly revived. A bakery reopened with an oven that once smelled consistently of warmth rather than ash. Children, who had come to the distribution like specters, reappeared with cheeks colored by runs and play. In the end, the memory of a bowl of soup was less about the broth and more about how the act reframed relationships. A commander's discretion to feed was not purely an administrative maneuver. It was a moral decision that asked soldiers to see civilians as neighbors in a fragile human architecture. For Mitchell and for those who had stood in the square, the choice to serve was part prudence, part pity, part conscience. It was, perhaps most importantly, a choice that allowed people to begin to imagine a life beyond the immediate exigencies of war. Is the soldiers left with stories, the townspeople with survival and memory, and the photograph with its steam remained tucked into albums and pasted on walls, as a modest testimony to what had been possible when humanity guided command. The feeding operation would be studied later by analysts looking at stability operations, and by historians searching for human moments amid strategic narratives. They would call it an example of civil-military cooperation, of field discretion exercised responsibly. For those who had been there, it was simply the afternoon when a child named Klaus was given a hot bowl, and when, for a while, the sound of hunger quieted beneath the hum of an engine. The square grew quieter as peace settled, but the echoes of that first ladle did not fully fade. In the place where men had once lined for soup, a small plaque was eventually set, comprised of metal and few words. It bore no trumpet. It bore a simple statement of remembering that on a hard April, when orders and men met need, someone had chosen to feed a child, and in doing so, opened a small path toward neighborliness that outlasted the war.